Hi everyone. So I'm Alicia. So I know I'm the last talk of the day, so I'm standing between you and your weekend, but hopefully it'll be a bit more casual. I feel very underqualified compared to the first two speakers, but this will be a little bit more about my experiences and my learnings. And I want to specifically talk about this topic of apply AI in healthcare, because I know you guys have probably learned a lot of the interesting stuff, the cutting edge stuff from Kwa, from Deepak, and Isabel. But we don't often talk enough about what happens after that. So that's what this talk is going to be about. So I'll just introduce myself a little bit. So I'm a geriatrician here in Melbourne. So I've trained locally. I'm currently at Peninsula Health, and I'm actually doing a PhD with the National Centre for Healthy Aging, which is an aging-focused research institute that was developed as a collaboration between Monash University and Peninsula Health. The reason this institute sort of came into existence is because the Mornington Peninsula is home to one of the fastest growing aging populations in Australia, which makes it a really good setting to conduct all sorts of research relating to healthy aging and aged care and residential aged care as well. We do a lot of different types of work. So we've talked a little bit about interdisciplinary sort of collaboration in AI. So I think our centre is a very good example of that. I'm actually only one of two doctors there at the moment. So we've actually got a whole heap of health professionals from allied health backgrounds. We've got data scientists, we've got data engineers, we've got biostatisticians and epidemiologists. So we sort of all work together in all aspects of healthy aging. But my research relates mainly to the data platform that's been developed at our centre. So it is essentially a research platform. I think it's one of Australia's first ones where we've actually extracted EHR data across Peninsula Health, cleaned it and curated it and integrated it into this research-ready data warehouse. So we've got access to a data set of real-world information. It contains not just structured data, so not just your vital signs and pathology tests and things like that, but also your clinical notes. So that's the unstructured data, the stuff that's a lot messier. So your walk around notes, your discharge summaries. Typically, how we've dealt with them is actually just reading through chart review, trying to extract things out of it for research purposes. But this data platform gives us the ability to look at it at scale. Across sort of 1 million patients. So that's just where I'm from. That's just a little bit more information about the data platform. So as I've mentioned in the center there, that's our core data set of structured data. And then we've actually implemented this CockStack open source clinical text extraction program from King's College London that allows us to pull across all the clinical notes and use it for research purposes. And at the moment, we're also actually linking up this data platform to a lot of government data sets. So things like Medicare, pharmacy, death data, hospital data, paramedic data. And the aim is that eventually we will have this data set where if you were to do research on an individual, you might be able to actually track the whole journey through the healthcare system as best as we can in the sort of silo data structures that exist within Australian healthcare system. And you can probably imagine that gives us access to do more research on populations that traditionally haven't been involved in clinical trials. So that's a lot of the older patients, as well as people that traditionally, don't enroll or follow through with cohort studies. So it just expands our ability to actually include everyone in the research that we do. So I'm not going to talk too much about my own research, but I just want to talk a little bit to set the context for why I went all the way to Unity Health. My PhD centers on this clinical problem, which is we're not very good at picking up dementia in people, not just across the community and the general public, but even within healthcare professionals. So in GP clinics, in hospital settings, we usually don't see it till it's very, very obvious, which is usually when they come in extremis or when they need to be urgently placed into aged care. And this obviously impacts patient care and outcomes in many, many ways, not just in terms of getting a diagnosis and access to post-diagnostic supports for people with dementia, but within hospital, we know that these people with dementia have higher rates of things like delirium, which carries an increased mortality rate. So the core problem is we're not picking them up. So can we actually look at all the EHR data that exists for an individual patient? Can we combine that with AI or data science methods and develop some models that we can actually improve detection in healthcare settings so that we can get in a little bit earlier and get these people the diagnostic support and care that they need? So this is where my research is. And like Deepak said, I've been we're working on developing models with the EHR data that we've got. But throughout my PhD, I've always asked this question of what comes next. So we're developing models, we're looking at data, great. We've got great AUCs, we've got great calibration. Next step, get it validated in an external sort of data set. But then what next, right? Like, do I just hand this model? Do I just hand the code to the IT system in hospital and they roll it out for me? Like, is there an AI expert that lives in a public hospital that I can just delegate this to and they can sort of deploy and monitor it for me? So I was always grappling with this question, and I've asked a lot of people around me, like my supervisors, people who are interested in AI, and no one could really give a very good answer to it. I think I've heard things like, oh, we'll just get the implementation scientists to come in and roll it out. Or, yeah, we'll worry about that when the time comes, sort of thing. But being a bit type A, it's sort of bothered me. Like, I can't see the end to this project I've started. And that's sort of where I went looking. So in academia and in PhD, as some of you might learn, is we do systematic reviews, right? To sort of find out what's a landscape of the evidence. So I said, okay, have people actually developed models like the one I'm planning to develop? How have they implemented it in whatever country they're in? So we did a systematic review, went through all the trouble, essentially found that there's more than 400 models like this published in the literature. 10% have actually gone on to the next stage of evaluation, which is taking it out of the development data set and testing it elsewhere. Only 2 have progressed to impact evaluation in the form of clinical trials, which takes a long time, takes a lot of money, and ultimately none have been implemented to date as far as we're aware. So that didn't really help me with my question. So then I looked a little bit broader at the sort of broader AI literature, and then you see all these headlines come up. Implementation gap, 80% fail to scale. Clinical AI is non-existent in Australia. How do we fix it? And I really like this quote by a Ukrainian company who said, look, we have calls and meetings with healthcare organizations all the time, and they tell us the same story. The AI pilot works beautifully in controlled settings. And then the moment they try and use it with real patients and with real doctors, everything falls apart. So we're seeing a very sort of common theme coming through the literature. And it's essentially, there's this huge implementation gap. Like 90% of the research that's being done in private and public sectors just drops off, and it never actually makes it into the real world. And why is that, right? So if we look at this recently published article in JAMA by Nguyen, the blue line at the bottom is the healthcare industry compared to all the other industries. At the bottom is time, and you can see the trend of sort of AI use in the healthcare industry over time. And we fall really, really short compared to all the other sort of industries out there. So this is not a problem that is specific to my project. This is a problem that's across all AI projects and AI research at the moment. So then, of course, I say, okay, let's see, what about the success stories? If I can't find like a general formula or a framework to implement it, maybe let's pick out the successful cases and try and learn from them. So one of the great ones I love is this Chat EHR tool. I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard of it. I think it's by Nigam Shah in Stanford. So it's a chatbot that accesses the whole EHR for a patient, and you can ask it any question, like, tell me about this patient's cardiovascular status, and it just summarizes things. Got troponins done 5 days ago, had a heart attack like 5 months ago, for example. It's a great example, but Stanford is really up there. They're very AI focused. They've got the leading minds, the hospitals attached to them are similar in culture. So it's not really applicable to Peninsular Health here in that sense. And then you hear about all these cases in Singapore, like they've done such amazing stuff in Singapore. They've rolled out the Selena retinopathy screening across the whole country. They've got multiple other sort of success stories coming out sort of every month. But then when you look at Singapore's political structure, healthcare structure, they're very top down. So they've got a government that drives change. They've created this ecosystem where healthcare organizations can very easily develop and adopt methods without reinventing the wheel. And we don't have that here in Australia, not even in Victoria, so not even in our own state. So now if we look at Australia, these are the success cases. So a lot of radiology success. I'm at radiology. They've rolled out chest X-ray and CT brain AI screening. Heidi Health, a lot of you probably have heard of it, is an ambient scribe. So it just dictates your letters as you talk to your patient. But a lot of these, again, exist in the private sector where arguably it's a smaller cohort of people to convince to take your tool and adopt it and take the risk that comes with it. So all of this was a great learning experience for me, but it still came back to this question, like I'm working in a public hospital. What about Australian public hospitals? We are at the end of the day, I would say 70 to 80% of people only ever come through our public hospitals. Private hospitals, private clinics, we're seeing adoption of AI tools much more quickly. Any of you guys have stepped foot into a public hospital know the bureaucracy that exists, how old the legacy systems are, how messy the systems are. Trying to effect change in public hospitals is almost incomprehensible. And that's why a lot of people step out of it. A lot of people say, it's all too much, let's go and do a startup. And we pitch to the private sector and we pitch to the consumers. We don't pitch directly to the government and to the public hospitals. So then that's that question, then do we just wait, right? In public hospitals, do we just wait till the rest of the world have perfected their solutions and implementation pipelines, and then we copy what they've done? That will take years and years and years. And we know there's so much good research happening in Monash and Melbourne, in sort of all the university systems. Like, we can't just be late adopters. We want to be early adopters or even innovators in this game. So that's where it brought me to Unity Health. So a lot of you probably haven't heard of it. Can I just have a show of hands, like no one's heard of it? Yep, okay, great. So Unity Health is essentially a healthcare organization based in Toronto in Canada. They've been on a little bit of a promotion spree over the last few years to promote the work they're doing, and that's how I heard about them through one of their lectures. They are structured quite similar to any organization here in Australia. So they've got 3 hospital networks. St. Michael's is the trauma metropolitan big city hospital, and they service a very disadvantaged population in downtown Toronto. They've got St. Joseph's, which is the community hospital, and they've got Providence Healthcare, which is the long-term rehab subacute site. Interestingly, they are the only hospital network in Canada that's sort of officially declared AI as their core strategic pillar of the organization. And they've established an in-house applied health AI program, and they've actually deployed more than 50 AI and data analytics tools over the last sort of 5 to 6 years. And you can see down there, that's Professor Mohammed Mamdani, who's the brains behind all of this. Very charismatic, and he managed to get a lot of people on side with him. Because of the success they've had, they've just rolled out the Health AI Academy this year across Canada, which is essentially a national initiative that aims to spread everything they've learned through their journey to the other hospitals in Canada, and to equip the other leaders of the other hospitals to be able to develop their own methods of deploying AI tools. And over the last few years, they've also actually collaborated with AI Sweden, which is Sweden's national AI initiative. And they're working to implement AI sort of deployment pipelines within all the Swedish hospitals as well. So they've enjoyed a little bit of sort of success. I think they're one of the sort of early movers in this field, and you may start to hear a bit more about them as you sort of venture into your careers as well. So before I go any further, so coming back to my question of what about our public hospitals, I had to see, okay, what's the similarities between our healthcare systems? So actually very, very similar. So there's only some differences. We've got PBS that subsidizes medications, whereas they don't. And we have slightly larger private sector roles. So a lot of us have private insurance. We can go to private hospitals and see private specialists. Theirs is heavily public. So people only get private insurance for things like dental, optometry. Otherwise, everything funnels through the public system. And so essentially we're very, very similar, right? We're tax funded, we're universal. And as I learned during my time there, the hospitals are very similar, all the programs and things are similar. So that's why some of the learnings from there may be applicable to our setting. So now I'll talk about my actual experience there. So I was with their in-house AI team, which is called the Data Science and Advanced Analytics team, the DSAA for short. They develop all these data-driven solutions, so not confined to AI, but anything within the realm of data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence. It's just a big toolbox to them, right? So they tap into that. They develop solutions for real-time clinical problems brought to them by clinicians, healthcare workers, nurses, allied health staff, even sort of PSAs, janitors on the ground. So anyone can come to them with a clinical problem, and then they develop a solution and help to integrate it into the clinical workflow. So they don't just give you a model, they say, we'll walk you through the whole system and get it working in your workflow that exists. So that's just a timeline of how they've developed. So they're quite recent, actually. So they started as a group of 2 to 4 people. So it's just a research group. Started with a sort of question of, can we use data science or data back in 2016 to identify people who might deteriorate and die unexpectedly? And then they built the early warning system ChartWatch as a result of that. So the model was a success. Their pilot showed that it reduced mortality rates by 20%. Of unexpected mortality in hospital. But then when they tried to operationalize it and implement it, that's when they ran into problem after problem after problem. And as you can imagine, with 2 to 4 people, there was like 1 clinician, 1 data scientist, and 1 researcher. They didn't have the manpower to spread into the clinical workflow and help people integrate and use it. So then Professor Mamdani actually went to Li Ka-shing. That I think Chris actually mentioned he got some funding from Li Ka-shing. So Li Ka-shing is a Hong Kong billionaire. I think he's in his 90s, but he does a lot of philanthropy work. And I think he's quite passionate about healthcare, as you can see. So Professor Mamdani gave his elevator pitch and essentially secured a fund of $10 million to help him develop this vision that he was thinking of, because no one in Canada had the money or wanted to give it to him. And you can imagine we're quite AI forwards now. Back then it was like, this is way too high risk. What are you even talking about implementing AI into a public hospital? So with that money, he didn't sort of start hiring people and start up the whole system. He actually saw that you had to build up the technical infrastructure, because the models we build in a lab, on our computers, in research institutes, we've got nice data sets, right? We train it up and then we validate it on another nice data set. And then we get nice pretty graphs of AUCs and things. But in the real world, how do you keep it coming real time, right? So if you've got all these variables, how do you sort of make sure the model is feeding off the most recent information, not just information from 5 years ago that some researcher curated? If you actually want it to be sort of creating clinical impact for that patient in front of you. So they invested years into building up actually the technical infrastructure, which I'll go through very briefly later on. And then finally, after that success, and they had a few more projects along the way, and finally they got leadership on board. So the hospital leadership said, this is cool, the work you're doing, we want to support you. And essentially when you're a research team, it's really hard to do certain things within hospitals because you don't have the access to the security systems and IT systems as much. And everything has to go through ethics before you can even start it. So they got integrated into the hospital under the IT system, but they function independently. And this is more impactful than you would think, because what it means is that all the models they develop for the problems within that healthcare organization become quality control, right? They're trying to improve the outcomes of the patients in the hospital. And so you don't have to go through, they still talk to ethics, but that you don't have to go through that major ethics barrier of, months of revising your ethics application just to be able to get one project off the ground. So this had a very big impact for the scale that they were able to operate within the hospital. And then over the last 4 to 5 years, they've just started building up their processes. And now currently the next focus is actually looking at scaling and how to get more funding to support this system. So I'll just talk very briefly, because this was a concept that sort of was quite new to me, and only really became clear when I went there, because you learn a lot of things about AI. You learn about, the cutting edge architectures, how things work, how do we fine tune things. A lot of that belongs in the realm of theoretical AI, which is where we've seen the leaps and bounds over the last few years. How do we push the boundaries? How do we go for superintelligence? How do we go for AGI? That's where all that stuff belongs. But apply AI, the focus shifts, where we're asking the question, how do we actually now take that AI and use it safely and effectively in the real world? And I think that's where we maybe haven't heard as much about. Certainly I didn't know much about it. And I think people are starting to become more aware as they're trying to continue their products and implement it. But the core focus here is actually practical implementation. So the shift is from the architectures and efficiency, shifts to clinical workflows. It shifts to people factors. People don't behave predictably. They don't use something just because you tell them it's good, right? So how do you do change management? How do you do implementation science? And more importantly, how do you evaluate it, not just in the academic language, so your AECs and stuff, but how do you actually evaluate it in terms of real world impact, right? Is it actually making a difference, or are we just wasting our money with all of this? So that's what Unity Health's DSAA team sort of focuses on. And I really like this quote by Professor Mamdani, which is it's really not just about building the technology. It's actually embedding AI into the culture of the organization, getting people to be open and acceptable to it, not just the select few that are really, driven in this area. And how do we embed it in the operations of the hospital so that it actually improves patient care and staff workflows, instead of just being something that you can be proud about in a news article, for example. So this is a little bit word heavy, but it's just to give you an idea of the skill set and the teams that it takes to actually do something like this. So there's 5 core teams under the DSAA. The first one is the data integration and governance team. So they're probably the most important people. They're the data engineers. They're the ETL experts who actually pull out all the information from, from Synapse, from Cerner, from everywhere. They condense it into a nice data warehouse that feeds directly into the model in real time, so that that patient in front of you, every time the vital signs update, you get a new sort of input into the model. So they're the ones that really have to spend time in the nitty-gritty of the data and actually figure out, if the clinician says, I want an FBE to go into my model, for example, they have to ask the questions. Okay, there's 5 timestamps for FBE. There's the time you order the FBE, there's the time the nurse collects the FBE, there's the time you actually send it to the lab and they receive it, there's the time that they actually release it, right? And there's the time that the doctor acknowledges that they've seen it. So those are the sort of nitty-gritty questions that they ask and they probe and they figure out to be able to answer the questions that the clinicians come to them with. Then you have the product management team, who are your project managers. They oversee everything. And calling them product managers means that acknowledging when it gets deployed, from then on, it's actually a product, because you're pitching it to your end users and your thinking has to shift. It's not just about the theoretical evaluation anymore. It's about, how do you maintain this product? And that includes things like, is it user-friendly? Are people actually using it? Do people like it? Do people hate it, for example? So this team sort of oversees everything. They keep everyone organized. They sort of organize the meetings, keep people on time. And importantly, they have some clinical informatics specialists who are versed with EHR systems, and they're the ones that go onto the wards, find out from people and clinicians, how are you doing things at the moment, and how does this change what you do day to day? Then you have the advanced analytics team. So that's your model developers. That's what sort of we think of when we think of AI. They're the data scientists, computer scientists who are actually building the models, they're developing this stuff. And then product development is something I didn't even think about, but I'm not sure if some of you here have engineering backgrounds, but it's about sort of back end, front end, full stack sort of linking up, and the UX and how clinicians interact with the product. So they sort of are responsible for the whole product after it's deployed. And finally, they have the commercialization sort of part, which is if we have a model that's working really well, how do we scale it to lots and lots of other hospitals without sending our own people over there and spending the money from our own hospital, for example? So this is an example. This is just, I've blurred out the names, but you can sort of see how big that team is to be able to get things working. And those are the 5 teams that I mentioned. And you can sort of see the roles under that there if it's not too small. And so I'll talk very briefly now about the process of how a model is developed and deployed. So there's really 2 phases to it. One is the actual development side, and then there's the deployment, post-deployment stage. So in terms of the project development, it's quite interesting. The way they think about the clinical problems is very different to how we think about it in research settings and in sort of more experimental settings. So this is a summary of what it looks like when a clinician or someone on the floor comes to them with a clinical problem, right? So for example, I might go to them with, oh, I want to use EHR data to find people with dementia, right? And then they will ask me all of these follow-up questions, things that I probably wouldn't have thought of. So you have to define a problem. You have to actually describe, okay, what's the current state of the process? So what's your clinical workflow at the moment? And where are we going to put this solution? Exactly at which point are we going to do that? Why do you think we need to use data science and AI to do this? Why can't we just get a cognition nurse to sit in ED and look at everyone that comes through, for example? So you have to be able to sort of justify why you think using this and investing in this is worthy of their time. Then you have to sort of have a think of, okay, who are all the stakeholders involved? Like in my head, it's like, oh, very, very obviously it's just the geriatricians, right? But no, it's actually the triage nurse has to be able to know that. The ED physicians have to be involved in it because they might be discharging people straight home who might have dementia. So they need to know in order to sort of link them up with supports. It's the nurses on the ground that sort of look after the patients, and there's lots and lots of other stakeholders you're forced to think about who's actually going to interact with the solution. And in terms of evaluation metrics, they have to list the metrics that it will actually impact in real life. So length of stay, mortality. So not just sort of the theoretical stuff, but what real world metrics are we looking at? You have to highlight what your anticipated risks of implementation are so that you can preempt it. And then you have to show that you've actually at least spoken to someone from each stakeholder group that you've thought of, to show that not all of them think it's, like one of them, I think it's a terrible idea, because you have no idea how nurses work on the floor. And finally, I really like point 7 because before they even start this, they force the clinicians to think about, when do we stop this product, right? So we just think about rolling it out, deploy it, maintain it. But if no one's using it, how do we assess if it's actually achieving the impact you're hoping to? Because this is all money that's being put into staff to maintain this product. So you have to justify from your clinical perspective when you say, okay, this is not working and let's stop and wrap it up. So these are the things that you're sort of forced to think about, which I, to be honest, I didn't have a clue about a lot of these things starting my research. And then finally, you have to, you have to sign this project charter, which is essentially like a contract between the Apply AI team and you as a clinical champion. And it's really just to prevent that problem of, in research land and academia, sometimes people start ghosting. It's like, oh, the project's not looking that great. I'm just going to stop replying to emails, for example. Here you're dealing with real money, real hospital budgets. So you have to sign it. You need to have the backing of someone that's quite high up in your department. And it outlines everything very, very clearly so that you don't change your mind and say, oh, I want to roll this out across the whole hospital, not just ED now, for example. So they're very, very, very sort of outcome focused, and there's very clear objectives to everything that they choose to take on. And it can take actually months of meetings between all of those teams and the clinical champions to actually get to this stage of signing this charter and starting the development process. So it's incredibly resource intensive, but I think we don't really know if there's better ways of doing that at this stage, but they've shown that it works and that they've managed to deploy things successfully. And this is a bit of a sort of busy image, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how it looks like from development all the way to launch and evaluation. And so because this comes under the arm of quality assurance, once they've developed something, they don't have to go through regulatory approvals. They don't have to go through FDA, TGA to get the approval to actually roll it out and test it on patients. They can just do a silent deployment in hospital of the model because this comes under the umbrella of quality assurance. And something I found really interesting, if you can see below there, there's two pipelines, the training and the inference pipeline. So the training pipeline is what they use to actually develop the models. So that's the historical data set, stuff that we use in research to actually train up the model and get it to work. And then the inference pipeline is the real-time data pipeline that pulls data across and feeds it into the model. And logically, you would think, okay, let's just train up the model first, and then we think about how to build that pipeline and pull the data across. But what they actually found was that when they tried doing that, a lot of data that was within the training data was no longer available in the inference pipeline. Because things get outdated, things change, variables change. And so they would end up having to go back and retrain everything based on what's available in the inference pipeline. So that is why they actually have to build up the inference real-time pipeline before they even start training the model. So this is all stuff that they've done through trial and error, and sort of with each project, they've picked up all of these things that can happen in real-world deployment. And then this is the part that I was very curious about because I didn't really know it existed. I thought you just hand it, deploy, hooray, done, right? But then there's actually a whole after deployment process. And so this sort of summarizes it. So with each project, they have to fill out an impact analysis form, which essentially just, again, forces the clinical champion to sit down, not be too proud of themselves, just for deploying it, and actually have a think about how has it been assessed, what impact has it achieved. And this is what's interesting. After you deploy a model, that's actually when a lot of the work starts. So they've had to automate all these feedback loops into the model to monitor its performance sort of ongoingly. And if the model performance changes or drops as a result of changes in data, for example, someone might have introduced a new form on the EHR system, people change the way they collect certain information, that can all affect your model performance because you might have sort of trained it on very perfect data or different variables before. So their team actually has a roster that's on call like 24/7. And whenever these drops, it needs to be automatically notified to that roster, to whoever's on that roster, and they have to troubleshoot. Is this a problem with the model, with the data, with the pipeline? Which one of those 5 teams do I redirect the problem to? And then the clinical informatics people that I talked about, they actually continue to stay on the wards because that's when you actually see, okay, we had a handful of very interested people, but now we've rolled it out to the whole hospital. How do they actually think? And often that's where the problems come up. People say, this is stupid, this doesn't work. Like, for example, why would I do this? It's too hard. So that's why the clinical informatics people sort of stay on for months sometimes to try and troubleshoot and try and make this sort of product successful. And they often have to do lots of interviews to figure out why people aren't using it or why, it's not working like expected. And often there's a formal evaluation after 6 to 12 months, and they see whether it meets that criteria to keep going or whether we should just stop and cut our losses now. And so this is where, apologies, I'm not an expert in this, but this is where I learned the concept of machine learning operating environment, MLOps. And this is essentially the crux of Apply AI. AI is more than just models if you actually want to use it in real world. You actually need to have the ecosystem and environment that allows you to run these models, and that's called MLOps. So this is a very nice image that just shows you what the components of it are. But MLOps involves a deployment pipeline, a way of monitoring your models, a way of alerting people if the performance drops, not just waiting for people to come back and assess it after 12 months, and a way to retrain and redeploy very quickly without going through the whole process again. And so these are the 4 key principles to it. You need to make sure that whatever you do, you can track the changes and roll back to previous versions if you need. So you need version control for reproducibility of methods. You need a way of automating and removing all those manual sort of error-prone steps so that humans have as little influence over it as possible, and so that the system can behave the same way every single time, so that when you roll it out to the other 10 hospitals in your network, it will perform the same way each time. I've already mentioned, you need a way of continuous monitoring so that it alerts people immediately. And most importantly, this is where we often don't give enough thought. You need a very clear governance and accountability structure. So when things go wrong, when updates need to be approved, who's the actual name that you have to email to get that done? Not just a wishy-washy, here's a research team, send it to that email, hope you get a response. You actually need clear roles and clear structures. And how do you protect your data? Who takes accountability for data leaks? And how clinicians provide feedback and things. And so this is a list of the current projects that they were working on during my time with them. So the ChartWatch system, they actually had to redeploy it because they had changed from they had changed EHR systems. So from something called Sunrise, I think, to Epic. So that involved a whole sort of rejigging of the pipelines, and then they had to redeploy it. They had just piloted a policy bot, which is a RAG-based chatbot that's linked to all the HR policies for hospital staff. And that was their way of experimenting with generative AI in a relatively low risk sort of clinical problem because that doesn't really impact clinical assessment. And then they had some other things, stuff like the nurse assignment tool, where I didn't even think of it as a problem, but obviously this is a problem that nurses in charge face a lot. So when you have a roster of staff, you have people of varying sort of seniority. You have people that have been here for 3 days and have already looked after the same patient. At the moment, in Australian hospitals and in their hospital, it involves a nurse in charge sitting there for sort of an hour or 2 hours, sort of thinking, okay, who do I allocate to which patient, for example? But then through doing this nurse assignment tool, they cut that down immediate sort of rostering. And so they were able to demonstrate a lot of cost savings with this stuff that we as clinicians might not really even think about. They have an ED wait times model that sort of displays the anticipated wait time in the waiting room for patients that come in, so that, they don't come to the triage nurse every 2 minutes and ask. And I think Royal Melbourne here has sort of deployed something similar from what I've heard last year. This is another risk prediction tool, so they can identify hemodialysis patients who are at high risk of unplanned hospitalization next 7 days and get them assessed early. And a traumatic brain injury model, where anytime a CT brain is done in ED, they don't have to wait for a radiology to cast their eyes on it. It just detects if there's possible brain bleeds and immediately alerts the ED physician. So these were just some examples of the real world problems they were tackling, and they were at sort of various stages of that development pipeline when I was there with them. So it was really cool sort of getting to see what the real world nitty-gritty, how messy it can be in real life. And so I've sort of summarized my key lessons from Unity Health in this one slide. And I'm not saying their approach is the perfect approach. They're not saying that either. You know, as you can see, it's probably quite, they need a lot of people, they need a lot of manpower. It's maybe not the most efficient system, but it does allow them to actually sort of complete that sort of product pipeline, if that will. But I think we don't really have better examples at the moment, or places that are similar enough to Australian healthcare systems. And so these are sort of my 5 key takeaway points. First is that model development is really only a tiny piece of the puzzle. I was quite surprised at how small of a role it had in the whole bigger scheme of things. There's sort of 999 other pieces that are needed for implementation. And so how the model developers approach the models and techniques is really just like a mechanic with a toolbox, right? You know, because they have the system in place, they can just use a logistic regression model. But if they want, they can use a large language model. It doesn't really matter. It's just what fits the purpose and what fits the problem. This is the second thing. So I was very surprised at how high level all the people sort of on those project charters were. You really need very supportive leadership, at least in this current era and this current ecosystem, to be able to push this. And I think that's something we maybe talk a little bit about, that, you know, it's a bit of a struggle in public health because we have bright young minds like you, like Deepak, you know, the younger people coming through with ideas, solutions, you know, different ways of thinking. But if your 60-year-old CEO or your 60-year-old CMO that, you know, is very risk averse, doesn't want to try anything, you just cannot progress it. Like, there's just nowhere for your project to go. And then you have to shave it off and make it sort of as low risk and things as possible. So you really need to get people on your side from very high levels to be able to back you to make these changes. The third lesson is probably the most important one for me. So end user support ultimately determines the success or the failure of the tool. So if you see a lot of tools that seem successful on deployment in the first month and the second month actually didn't end up being that successful in the long term and end up getting sort of canned further down the track. And why is that? It's because your stakeholders or your end users aren't using it. And so if that's one thing for you guys to take away today for whatever projects you guys plan to do in the future, you probably don't have to do it to that level of detail, but at least start to have a think about who are your end users and what sort of problems might they have with it, right? If it's something that's easily tackleable at the beginning, then you don't waste a year working on a project that no one's going to use. I really like this 4th lesson, and it's you don't need a saw to cut a string when a pair of scissors is enough. So it's the idea of there's a toolbox, right? We don't need to shove a foundation model in every problem space, for example. If it's a simple problem, use simple solutions. I think in academia, we're very guilty of sort of chasing the sort of cutting edge stuff, like let's get the flashier models, let's do something that wows people. But in the real world, it's quite different. Do what's practical. Don't throw your compute intensive solutions at a tiny, tiny little problem. And finally, interdisciplinary work is so key. So we all have to learn to speak each other's languages more than ever. So in the past, I think we would say it's enough just to be able to speak the language of other healthcare professionals. But now we're working in a world where, like Leo Celli said, like we are going to be working with data scientists, computer scientists, engineers from all sorts of backgrounds, healthcare workers from all sorts of backgrounds. Everyone in this team had a very unique pathway into healthcare. And so when you see the team meetings between all of them within the team, they have learned how to speak each other's languages. But you can really contrast that to when they bring in clinical champions and stakeholders. Sometimes you see that the messages just don't go across. Like the clinician's saying something and they're like, why don't you understand what I'm saying? And the DSAA team's like, I don't understand what you're saying. Why aren't you getting what I'm saying? So we have to learn to be multilingual, not just in language, but in terms of our working relationships, I think. So these are really just my main takeaways, and hopefully if you guys can just bear this in mind going into the future. It's not to stifle your imagination or your creativity, but I think it's important to have an idea of the real world while you're developing your solutions so that you don't end up with like a wasted effort at the end of the day. And so I really like this quote, which is knowing and learning how to fine tune an LLM is a very strong technical skill, but knowing how to actually translate AI safely into clinical care is a career. And I think that's where all of you guys probably have the potential here, right? It's going to be a new world, it's going to be a new healthcare system, but I think you should really sort of invest your time and effort into learning a bit more about that. So that you can bring all the different worlds together when you guys eventually go into the healthcare system. Yeah, so that's the end of my talk. I'll take any questions. I'll just thank, just acknowledge the Uni Health team who are very patient and they love questions. So any of you guys have questions, they're always happy to be contacted, as well as my team for sort of funding my travel as well. Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question as well. So I remember you mentioned the inference, like in the picture for the inference and training pipeline, you mentioned there were instances where sometimes some data is missing. Could you like show, like what's an example of like that sort of like mismatch happening?
Right. I didn't see any sort of clear examples during my visit there, but I think what they're saying is if you have a training data, for example, like even if they just use Sunrise before instead of Epic, and they train their model on the Sunrise data, the way they display your vital signs, the way they display, coding, the ICD-3 versus 4 versus 5 codes, for example, there's going to be differences in how it was done 5, 10 years ago compared to how it's done right now. Some things may not be quite as important, right? Like, so the timing of your FB, that's easily sort of overcomable. But if they were using an ICD-3 definition for a condition, and now you've trained it on that, you've trained it to recognize that as a predictor, and now you want to bring it into your real world. But for example, the dementia definition has changed from ICD-3 to ICD-5 in the sort of handbook for ICD, then that's where you might run into problems because your model performance might drop, for example. And it's just because it hasn't sort of recognized the same pattern in that data set. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think there was another example for the TBI
Yeah.
that could you share that anecdote? I think it was something about like radiology, like having different opinions around where the TBI model could be used.
Yeah. So that was a great example. I think that's an example of end user importance because when that TBI model was a bit different in that it was developed by a research team and then brought into the hospital team. So it wasn't developed by the DSAA team. So they had developed this way of detecting brain bleeds, and the initial end user was the radiologists. It was like, okay, radiologists have like 50 CTs waiting for them at any one time. We want to be able to sort of bring these to your attention very quickly so that you pay your attention to that and then you click into it and report it as quickly as you can so that you let the ED physicians know. And then when they actually rolled out, they faced a lot of hostility from the radiology team who said, we don't use your system. We have our own radiology system. So you're telling us to open the Sunrise or Epic system where you've put in the orders and developed this model and you've planned for it to be implemented in there. And you want us to look at two different systems, not just at our wait list, but your wait list. And they were like, that's stupid. Like, it's going to cost us more time. We're not idiots. Like, like we know how to triage. So that was quite surprising for them, like how much pushback they got from the radiologists. And it was just lucky that the ED physicians were like, hey, we love that. Like, we don't want to wait for the radiologist all the time. If you let us know quickly, we can get neurosurgeon involved ASAP, right? Like we don't need to wait for a report. So that was I guess, lucky sort of episode that they found a different group of end users that would benefit from it. But there was that other sort of example where they had another external model brought in by, I think, the academic teams at the university that was very good at telling you sort of the probability that someone was going to be ready to go home within 3 days' time. So for discharge planning purposes, So they brought it to actually the exec team in the hospital who said, great, this will help with patient flow, right? And we'll be able to every day be able to highlight who's going to be going so we know how many beds we have tomorrow for the wards. And so they came to the DSAA team and they're like, can you implement it for us? Like, it's not, you didn't develop it, but can you implement it? And so the DSAA team sort of went out, spoke to people on the ground as they deployed it. And again, they faced a lot of hostility from the clinicians who said, my problem is not deciding if this patient's ready for discharge in the next 3 days or not, right? Like sometimes we're just waiting on the renal function to get better in a day or two. So we roughly know who these people are. We roughly know they're ready to go in a day or 2 or 3, right? That does nothing for me. And I don't want to have to attend another meeting where we go through all the outputs of this model with the nurse unit manager, because that's just a waste of my time, because I do that anyway in my ward round. And so they pushed quite hard for it because it came from top down. And so I think they rolled it out for close to like 6 months, and the clinical informatics experts like said they got like a little bit verbally abused on the ward sometimes, because people would just see them coming in, they were like, oh, they're here to talk about that again. And so that was a really difficult project for them, because they had to answer to the execs while trying to convince end users who didn't believe in the product. And so they ended up canning it, but it sounded like there was a lot of money and effort put into it. So those are like some really good real world examples of, well-meaning model developers, but like useless in real life sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, these are really good gems. With regards to the competition, like this is what we're looking for when it comes to like implementation, feasibility, and these are the sorts of things we want you to talk about in your pitch so that we know what you're thinking about. We've got a few more questions actually. So Farhan's asked, so you mentioned that Heidi and IMED, the chest X-ray were rare examples of successful translation of theoretical AI. What factors influence their success? And also, I think that it reminds me of the slide on the private versus public and how Unity is actually, in fact, like more public than us in a way, which was also surprising because I've seen more successful AI translation in more private systems, I guess. But yeah, your reflections on Heidi and
I think so a lot of my colleagues in private use Heidi. So I think in private land, sometimes I've sort of mentioned this already, but to be able to adopt a new tool like this, all you kind of have to do is convince your practice manager, right? Like if you're in a specialist clinic, just say to whoever's the boss of your clinic, say, I think this will really help. I'm not going to go through ethics. I'm not going to do a whole bunch of things. As long as each patient that walks through our door, I consent them. Like technically you can just get over those ethics barriers just like that. Whereas it's really not that simple in a public healthcare system, because we don't consent people to even putting their information on our EHRs. So a lot of patients don't know that we use the EHR records for the purposes of research. So if we were, research is slightly different because you can fully de-identify them. But if we were going to roll out these sorts of AI tools in a real world public hospital, it really opens this can of worms. And I'm currently doing some interviews with stakeholders. So like I know what this can of worm contains. And it's people being like, you are not to use our data, for example. If I were to find out that my data was going through an AI model or going through an ambient scribe, and then I found out, 80% of people like, yeah, that's cool, like AI is coming eventually, but 20%, the anti-vaxxers, people who have stronger beliefs, they might be like, why'd you do that? Like you might end up with lawsuits against the hospitals. So I think we're dealing with like a very different beast when it comes to the public healthcare system. And I think that's why places like IMET Radiology and Heidi Health have found sort of quicker success in Australia, because they've really just targeted the private sectors. And I think it's quite smart. Like I think Heidi have gone the smart way. I think the founders said that they initially had this very complex AI system and they realized no one wanted to take on that risk. So that they were like, okay, let's just shrink it down to scribe, because your average clinician will be okay with that level of risk and your average patient will be okay. And so they managed to get people on board and they've expanded so quickly. And I wouldn't be surprised if our public hospitals end up adopting Heidi in some way or another, because they've demonstrated their success. But I think like Chris said, Chris C, public hospitals and universities have to see proof of efficacy, and they have to know how much it costs. And that's why we're so slow to adopt things, because we're just waiting to see what happens with other people before we go on board. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Farhan. I've got another question from chat. So CJ, who's one of the lab members, he runs the MARC project, which is sort of, it's medical AI research collaboration. So clinicians come in with suggestions or things that they were looking to work together with. And one of the barriers has been also in terms of compute or local compute that hospitals have, that frequently there are projects that we would much rather work with like AWS or some cloud provider of GPUs because it's easier to manage, it's far, far cheaper. Do you have any reflections on that from Unity with regards to how they managed?
So they had to do open source, locally hosted models. And this is maybe not so much from them, from my center as well. So I think we face the same problem where we would love to chuck our patient data, unstructured data through like a really powerful LLM, but we're actually not allowed to. So the patient information, if it can be de-identified properly, you are allowed to sort of send it off the hospital service. It just has to be hosted within sort of Australian servers. But when it comes to things like clinical notes, sort of unstructured data, you can never fully de-identify it. So you might take away the names, but arguably you can say this person with this wife and this past history and stuff, you can piece it together, right? There's always that theoretical risk. I don't believe we currently have the legislation or the governance to guide us in terms of what we do in this sort of grey space. So at the moment, our hospital, which they were quite sort of progressive with allowing this data warehouse to be built, but ultimately that is still the hospital's data and we cannot run it on any model that's not locally hosted. So I think that's probably a problem that you guys would run into. And there's lots of like vendors coming out. So I think Copilot, Azure, AWS, a lot of public hospitals probably looking at partnering with some of these cloud-based servers. But again, there's like other risks there that we probably won't go into today. But yeah, just nothing's really that well thought out yet at the moment. So we're all operating within a little bit of a grey area. And whenever the AI Act or legislation or new governance documents come out for Australia, I think we might see things change a little bit. Yeah, depending on how conservative the government is. Yeah.
Amazing. Any other questions from the group?
Yep. So I just had a bit of a question about your research, what you're doing now. So you were talking a bit about Alzheimer, not Alzheimer, dementia and like early detection.
Yes.
So I was sort of looking to do something similar for my thing, or not on Alzheimer, or not on dementia, but that's kind of like primary prevention. I mean, also like screening sort of thing. So like, I just want to know a bit about like, how did you look for your stakeholders and sort of analyze the market just to like help me start off with doing that?
Okay. I guess for me it was, so maybe I'll tell you about what my sort of end user looks like, and then hopefully that will guide a little bit of your thinking. So ours was really clinical problem driven. So we wanted to be able to find the people that could flag as high cognitive impairment risk or high dementia risk as they come in through hospital, so that if they're to be sent home, we can link them up with community care and sort of CADMs or memory support referrals. And if they were to come through hospital, then we could decide who gets a single room, who gets a delirium prevention package that's really resource intensive, and who gets the early physio, early sort of social work referral. So because that was our clinical problem, we thought of it in terms of two pathways. One is if they went home and one is if they came into hospital. And that's how we sort of thought about who the stakeholders would be. Because obviously the stakeholders are quite different if they go home as if they come into hospital. And again, it'll be quite different if you were seeing them in a GP clinic and not in an ED or a hospital setting. So for example, for our hospital stakeholders, then that would have to be the nurses on the wards, because they're the ones that sort of manage the bed availability and who gets sort of more attention, more frequent observations, things like that. Geriatricians actually aren't as much of a stakeholder, surprisingly. It's actually more the treating doctors. So the admitting doctors tend to be Met Reg, so they're your stakeholders. The ED doctors who see them initially, they're your stakeholders. Your physios and your social workers who are going to be sent to see them straight away without much workup, they're going to be your stakeholders as well. Yeah, so we're currently not nowhere near that phase of implementation or deployment, but that's just sort of the thinking that we have around it. And then the other sort of obvious group I forgot to mention is the people with dementia and their families. So I'm currently doing some interviews with them to see like how acceptable this idea is to them. And then your general public, so the people who don't have a dementia diagnosis, but they're going to be the ones getting the information that, hey, you flagged as high risk as dementia in our system. So they are the people that you have to consult to say, okay, like examples of questions I asked them in my interviews is stuff like, you know, if we were going to do that, if there was a risk score like this, do you want to know, right? Or do you just want your doctor to handle it? And if they think there's a problem, they let you know. And surprisingly, a lot of them said, no, let me know, right? Like the doctors can tell me what they think. They might say they don't agree with it, but you have to let me know. Because what if I come back in 6 months later and that time I have a delirium and then someone's like, oh, 6 months ago you flagged as high risk. I'll be very shocked then because I could have started to sort of seek a sort of private geriatrician referral or do some like basic sort of primary prevention stuff like improve my diet, vascular risk factors, things like that. So that was a little bit unexpected for us because there's actually a strong sense of autonomy that if my data is generated as something that tells me something about my health, I want to know. So that's just like the thinking that we have around how to identify your stakeholders. In terms of market, probably I can't answer that question because we're a public hospital, but yeah. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that gives me like a really nice place to start
Okay,
and
great.
thinking about this project. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you can ask me afterwards or
Okay, yeah,
other
thank you.
times as well. Yeah, okay.
Just following up from that, like how has the Unity Health teachings changed, I guess, your future, the way you're thinking about the research right now? As in, like, do you have more stuff in place with regards to, okay, let's like beyond the research, like this is how we're gonna move forward after that?
Yeah, so that's probably more, that's a bit above my level at the moment. So what I have actually just been trying to do is actually spread this information a little bit. Because I think you guys probably deal with it as well, but in hospitals, you've got heads of units, you've got, you know, people that are saying, oh, do AI, right? Use AI. And there's none of these considerations at all. My director, like the other day, who's my supervisor, you know, was like, oh, let's develop a model and operationalize it. And your first question would be, okay, who's your end user, right? And then obviously it's the patients. But no, you have, for our center especially, because we're developed to try and build scalable solutions across different hospitals, not just our hospital. The question is, do you want an AI model that works really well in Peninsula Health with the data science support team that we have? Or do you want a model that's going to be used in every hospital across Australia? Because the approach you take to that will be dramatically different. Because I can say we've got compute, right? Like if we're just going to use it in Peninsula Health, we've got AI for its leadership. Then we can run it on large language models. We can do complex stuff with it. But if your ultimate aim and your goal is to say, no, I want every hospital across Victoria to have a way of screening these patients out, then you might be better off with like a regression model. Like it sounds simple, but it's doable across multiple hospitals. Another way of thinking of it is you can have a baseline model that has at least a satisfactory accuracy of like 80% that you can promote to the other hospitals. And then within your hospital, depending on your expertise, you can scale it up, use slightly more advanced techniques as well. So I would say that sort of just even crafting that thinking, I think getting to stage of operationalizing things like this, it takes quite a leap to do what they did. And you know, there's not a whole lot of billionaires willing to give $10 million out there, and not a lot of Mamdanis out there either. But I think the small steps we can think is when you're developing a model, have a think about how you might operationalize it, and have a think, just like I said, about who your end users are. I think that's a shift in the right direction. Like you said, there's always that tension. Like Maya, who's one of the neurologists in our special interest group, She's also a PhD student, but we also have discussions about this tension of, you know, creativity, keeping open-minded, not getting sort of pushed down by dinosaurs like us in the healthcare system who are like, oh, you can't do that, you can't do this, but also being a little bit realistic and practical and not sort of aiming for the stars when no one's telling you to do that sort of thing. Yeah.
Any last questions?